There are days that seem ordinary right up until the moment they are not. Ryan Callahan had been having one of those days. He was 38 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of quiet face that does not give much away, the sort of man who had spent 15 years learning to stay steady when everything around him was anything but he had been a firefighter. For all of those 15 years and 3 months ago, the department had let him go, not for anything he did wrong. The budget cuts had come through in September, the kind of cold administrative decision that arrives in an envelope and ends a career with 2 paragraphs and a signature, and Ryan had sat at his kitchen table that evening for a long time, reading those 2 paragraphs over and over as though somewhere in the second reading they might say something different. They did not say something different, so he had spent 3 months doing what you do. He updated a resume he had not touched in 15 years. He asked people he knew for leads. He took a part-time security shift at a warehouse on the east side to cover the bills. He got up every morning and made coffee and told himself that something would come through because something always comes through. That was the thing his father had told him. A man who had worked 30 years in a factory and raised 4 kids and never once complained about any of it. Something always comes through, Ryan. You just have to stay standing long enough to receive it. Today was the day of his most important interview. The position was head of safety operations at Callaway Industries, a mid-sized firm that managed 4 commercial buildings downtown. It was a real job, a good job, the kind of job that used every skill he had built over 15 years without requiring him to start completely from scratch. The interview was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon. It was currently 7:45 in the morning. Ryan was driving home from his overnight warehouse shift, still in his work clothes, planning to shower and change and go over his notes one more time, when he smelled its smoke, not the distant smell of someone's fireplace or a backyard burn pile. The sharp, urgent smell of something that should not be burning. He turned his head and saw it, the building on the corner of Weston and 5th, a 4-story apartment block that he had driven past 100 times, had smoke pushing out from the second-floor windows in the particular way that meant the fire was already inside the walls. And moving fast, he pulled over. Before he had consciously decided to pull over, he was out of the car, before the engine was fully off. There were people on the sidewalk already, residents in coats and pajamas and bare feet, and someone was on a phone, and someone else was pointing up at the second floor and saying, "She is still up there. She is still up there." Ryan grabbed the arm of the nearest person, a man in his 60s with a bathrobe and wide eyes who, he said, "Which window? Second floor, left side." The man said, his voice was shaking, "The young woman. She moved in 2 months ago. I knocked on her door, but there was no answer." Ryan looked up the window on the left side of the second floor, had a gray curtain hanging out of it where someone had pushed the glass open, and the smoke coming through it was darker than the smoke from the other windows, which meant the fire was closer to that room than to the others. He looked at the building entrance. The front door was propped open. Someone had come out and left it that way, and the smoke in the lobby beyond it was thick but not yet black, which meant there was still a path. He knew this, the way he knew it from 15 years of reading buildings, the way other people read faces. He pulled his jacket up over his nose and went in. The stairwell was clear enough to move through quickly. He took the stairs 2 at a time, staying low where the smoke was heavier near the ceiling, and found the second-floor hallway filling fast but still passable. He counted doors from the stairwell left side, second from the end. He hit the door with his shoulder once. It gave on the second try, and the heat that came out of the room was serious, the fire already in the wall to the right, the curtains on that side fully gone. The woman was on the floor near the window. She was young, dark-haired, somewhere in her late 20s or early 30s, wearing a gray hoodie, and she was unconscious. Not from burns, but from the smoke, which had done its quiet work while she slept. She was alive. He could see that immediately. He crossed the room, dropped to one knee, checked her breathing, shallow but present, and got his arms under her. He lifted her. She was not a small woman, but she was not heavy for him, and more than size, what he felt in that moment was the specific weight of someone who was completely trusting you with their life in the way that only unconscious people can, fully and without reservation. He got back to the hallway. He got to the stairs. He got out. The paramedics arrived at almost exactly the moment he cleared the front door. He set her down on the sidewalk and stepped back and let them take over, because that was the correct thing to do, and he stood there with his hands on his knees, breathing the cold morning air, and listening to the sound of the fire trucks arriving at last. The woman was loaded onto the gurney before they got her fully onto it. She stirred, her eyes opened. They were dark brown, and even half-conscious and disoriented, they were sharp, the eyes of someone whose baseline state was paying attention. She looked up at the sky, and then she looked at Ryan. He was still crouched nearby. He said, "You are okay. The paramedics have you." She blinked, she said, in a voice roughened by smoke. "Did you carry me out?" "Yes," he said. She looked at him for another moment. Then the paramedics moved her, and the moment passed. Ryan stood up. A police officer took his name and his account of what had happened, and told him he was lucky, and that he should not have gone in without equipment. And Ryan nodded because all of that was true, and also entirely beside the point. He looked at his watch. It was 8:40 in the morning. He had 5 hours before his interview. He went home. He showered for a long time, letting the hot water work through the smell of smoke that had settled into his hair, and his skin he dressed carefully. The gray suit he had bought second-hand but had pressed twice this week, the dark tie, the good shoes his daughter had given him for his birthday 2 years ago. He sat at his kitchen table with his notes. He read them. He could not retain a single word of them. His mind kept going back to the woman's face when she looked up at him. That fraction of a second between not knowing what had happened and beginning to understand it, that raw, unguarded moment of pure relief. He had seen that look many times. Over 15 years it never got ordinary. He drank his coffee and let his mind settle, and at 1:15 he got in his car and drove to the interview. The offices of Callaway Industries were on the 14th floor of a glass building downtown, the kind of building that has a lobby with high ceilings and a receptionist who greets you with a visitor badge and asks you to take a seat. Ryan sat. He looked at his hands. There was a faint redness on the back of his right hand where a piece of falling debris had caught him on the way out of the building. He had not noticed it until the shower. He turned his hand over and looked at it and thought about his father. Something always comes through. At 1:58, a door opened. The woman who walked out was wearing a charcoal blazer, and her dark hair was still slightly damp at the ends, the way hair looks when it has been washed in a hurry, and she had a slight roughness to her voice when she greeted the receptionist that was not entirely gone. Even now, she was the woman from the fire. She stopped. She looked at Ryan. Ryan stood up. They looked at each other across the lobby of the 14th floor of a glass building downtown, 5 hours and 40 minutes after he had carried her unconscious out of a burning building on Weston, and fifth, her name, as it turned out, was Nora Callaway. She was 41 years old. She was the founder and chief executive of Callaway Industries, and she was the person who would be conducting his interview. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then she said, with that slightly roughened voice, "You have got to be kidding me," he said. I genuinely did not know. She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "Come in." They sat across from each other at the conference table. She had a copy of his resume in front of her, and she looked at it for a moment without speaking. Then she looked up. She said, "I want to ask you something before we start, and I want you to answer it honestly." He nodded. She said, "This morning, when you went into that building, did you think about whether it was a good idea?" He considered the question the way it deserved to be considered. "No." He said. She waited. He said, "I thought about what the situation required. I thought about the smoke color and the window and the stairwell. I did not think about whether to go in because that part was already decided." She was quiet for a moment. "Why was it already decided?" She said. He thought about how to say it accurately. He said, "Because 15 years ago I made a decision about what kind of person I was going to be. When you make that decision clearly enough, you do not have to remake it every time a situation comes up. It is already made." Nora Callaway looked at him for a long time. He did not look away, and he did not fill the silence with anything. She said, "I built this company from 11 people to 230 over 14 years. I have interviewed hundreds of people for dozens of positions, and I want to tell you that the answer you just gave me is the most honest answer I have heard in this room in a very long time." He said nothing, she said. "But I still have to ask you the standard questions because my HR director is watching through the window there, and she will never forgive me if I skip them." He glanced at the window. There was indeed a woman on the other side making a face that was trying very hard to be professional. He almost smiled. "Go ahead," he said. She asked her questions. He answered them. He was not nervous. He had noticed that somewhere around the third question, the nervousness had simply not shown up, the way it sometimes did not when you had already done something harder earlier in the same day. When she was done, she closed the folder. She said, "I am going to offer you the position," he said. "I want to be clear that I do not expect that because of this morning. I know you do not," she said. "And that is part of why I am offering it." She leaned back in her chair. "I have 230 people in 4 buildings, and every single day I trust that if something goes wrong, someone will do the right thing without waiting to be told. That is not a small thing to trust." She looked at him steadily. "You did it this morning before you knew anything about me or this company or this job. That is the version of a person I want making decisions about safety in my buildings." Ryan looked at the table for a moment. He thought about the envelope that had arrived in September. He thought about 3 months of mornings. He thought about his father. Something always comes through. He looked up. He said, "When do you need me to start?" She said, "Monday?" He nodded. She stood and extended her hand across the table. He stood and shook it. Her grip was firm and direct, the grip of someone who had built something real from nothing and knew what it cost at the door. She paused. She said, without turning around, "I would have gotten out on my own, you know," he said. I know she turned just enough to look at him over her shoulder. She was almost smiling good, she said, "because I need people who respect that the person they are helping is capable, not people who need to be the hero." He understood what she was telling him. "I know the difference," he said. She nodded once and she walked out. Ryan stood in the conference room for a moment outside the window. The city moved in its usual afternoon way. The traffic and the pedestrians and the ordinary ongoing business of people living their lives. He looked at the redness on the back of his hand. He thought about the woman on the floor near the window this morning, and the way the weight of her had felt in his arms, and the look on her face when she came back to herself. On the sidewalk, he thought about his father, gone 9 years now, who had worked 30 years in a factory and raised 4 kids and never once asked for more than what the day offered. Something always comes through. Ryan picked up his jacket from the chair. He walked out through the lobby and pressed the button for the elevator and stood quietly while it descended 14 floors. When the doors opened onto the lobby, he walked out into the afternoon. The air was cold and clean. He turned up his collar and he walked to his car, an ordinary man at the end of an extraordinary day, carrying the quiet knowledge that the most important thing he had done before 9 o'clock that morning had nothing to do with a job or an interview or anything he could have planned. It had simply been being the person he had decided 15 years ago to be. And that had been enough. It had always been enough. He just had not known yet that today was the day it would change everything. If this story stayed with you, please give it a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this one, and leave us a comment below. Tell us about a moment when simply being yourself opened a door you never expected. We read every single one.